Hello everyone, welcome to today's IMISCOE GenSeM seminar series titled Exploring the Interplay of Masculinities, Migration and the Gender Roles Across Border. My name is Abu Saleh Mohammad Sawad. I am a PhD candidate in the Department of Sociology and Anthropology at Concordia University, Montreal. And today we have with us two esteemed researcher, Dr. Marc Lafrance, Associate Professor, Department of Sociology and Anthropology, and Interim Vice Dean, Faculty of Arts and Sciences at Concordia University in Montreal, Canada, and Dr. Huizinga, Assistant Professor, Department of Human Geography and Spatial Planning, Utrecht University in the Netherlands. Before we start, I want to provide a brief introduction to both of our panelists here today. Dr. Marc Lafrance studies men and masculinities related to media representations, body image and body modification, identity and lived experiences, and political radicalization. He has published over 50 papers in high-impact journals, edited anthologies, guest-edited two special issues, and co-edited two scholarly book collections. He has maintained an active research profile funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council in Canada. He is the recipient of research fellowships at the University of Oxford, Örebro University, and the Jexel International Collegium for Advanced Transdisciplinary Gender Studies. Lafrance's work in both French and English and maintains close collaborations with scholars in Denmark, Norway, Sweden, the United Kingdom, and the United States. Lafrance makes regular contributions to the print, radio, and televisual media. Our second panelist, Dr. Huizinga's research investigates contemporary social and cultural issues within the framework of globalization, migration, and societal change. Huizinga focuses on gender, masculinity, and intersectionality, along with the experiences of refugees, migration, and settlement. He also examines young people's identities and issues of equality. His work explores how structural forms of marginalization, such as ageism, racism, sexism, and capitalism, impact everyday life and highlight diverse forms of resistance against exclusionary practices. Huizinga is engaged in qualitative and participatory research, paying particular attention to positionality, reflexibility, and ethics. As an ambassador of Utrecht University's Dynamics of Youth, he specializes in geographies of youth, studying how young people navigate the transition to adulthood. His publication on gender, masculinities, and forced migration appear in prominent journals, and he has co-authored an entry on masculinities in the International Encyclopedia of Human Geography. He is also a member of the GenSeM steering group of IMISCOE. So before starting our seminar today, I want to provide you with a brief introduction of the topics of masculinity, migration, and gender roles, and how they are interconnected. So traditionally, transnational migration research overlooked the interplay between mobility, settlement, and gender identities, treating men's migration as a natural phenomenon. In the 1970s and early 1980s, migration studies focused exclusively on men and their roles as universal providers, neglecting women who were either absent or depicted as passive followers of their male counterparts. Such researchers not only ignored the involvement of partners, families, and communities in the migration process of men, but also failed to consider migrant men as gendered individuals or to examine their complex negotiations during the post migration settlement. This unidimensional portrayal of migrant men created a paradox. They have been over researched as normative migrants but are understudied as gendered beings due to their generalized assumptions made about the monolithic nature of their migration experiences. The 2000s mark a turning point for scholarly inquiry into masculinities and their interplay with migration, as studies focused on male migrants in both traditional and non-traditional jobs, exploring how migration impacts masculinities and leads to achieving adulthood. Since the late 2010, research has expanded to encompass second and third generation men, expatriate men, male diasporas, and the migrant community relations, offering a more nuanced understanding of diverse male migrant experiences. Until recently, most studies on masculinities and transnational migration did not recognize the diversities of men's migration experiences caused by the intersectionality of their racial, ethnic, class, sexual, religious, and other identities. In this way, transnational migrant men's gender experiences has been overlooked entirely, marginalizing them in the transnational gender analysis of migration scholarship. So, our goal for this seminar today is to be engaged with the critical studies of men and masculinities and the complex interplay between masculinities, migration experience, and the reshaping of gender roles across borders. So, without further ado, I would like to invite our first speaker, Dr. Marc Lafrance, to talk about his paper, which is titled Enemies and Allies: The Social Construction of Migrant Masculinity in an Age of Radical Right-Wing Populism. And before going to the next part, I want to apologize for some technical problems that we were unable to record the first half of Mark's speech, but after that, you can listen to the rest. I'll now invite Dr. Rick Huizinga to for his talk, which is titled From Crisis and Conflict to Care and Repair: Rethinking Forcibly Displaced Men and Masculinities. There you go, Rick.
Thanks, Sawat. Can you hear me properly? And you see my presentation, right? Great. Thank you very much, first of all, Sawat, for organizing this this seminar, and I'm very happy to be able to present my work on migrant men and masculinities. I'm Rick Huizinga. I'm a social-cultural geographer. So actually, I think my presentation will be quite a bit different from Mark's, because I will actually try to focus on these lived experiences based on my doctoral fieldwork that I conducted between 2016 and 2020, using qualitative and participatory research approaches. So I want to present some of this work. It includes work on hegemonic masculinity, intersectionality, and more recently, I've been thinking more explicitly about care and caring as ways to investigate everyday lives of male refugees. And so the main point, my main point is that to advance progressive understandings of forcibly displaced men and masculinities, that I think we need to investigate more in detail the various and ambiguous ways in which migrant men are emotionally invested in intimate relationships. And what I'm presenting today is part of a chapter I'm writing up for the Oxford Handbook of Intersectional Approaches to Migration, Gender and Sexuality. And I hope it will give some input for the discussion later on in the panel. So this part of my talk, I think, was excellently covered by Mark. So I was trying to put together some of the stereotypical representations of migrant men, in particularly in the case of this research, Muslim migrant men, or at least those who are often misrepresented or misrecognized as Muslim. So the premise of the talk is that the world has an issue with refugee men and masculinities, and as Mark already mentioned, forcibly displaced men and masculinities are one, I think, of the most emotive social, societal, and political topics in contemporary debates. And my point here is that these dominant geopolitical narratives, they don't float around, but they actually also impact refugee men everyday life, and influence also the way in which they negotiate different types of masculinities on a daily basis, which I think Benjamin was also hinting at. So how masculinities are enacted, experienced, performed in different places, such as public places. And what I particularly want to point out here in terms of vulnerability is that although forcibly displaced men and masculinities are often very visible in these social and political debates, we rarely really see something that is about their identities or how they surface as gendered subjects who face specific inequalities, insecurities, vulnerabilities. And this is very important, given that I think the claim to asylum is essentially around vulnerability, and this description tends to attach vulnerability to the person, which is quite often a woman or a child, rather than describing the sort of like threats, the challenges, the situations that actually create these vulnerabilities. And I think when vulnerability then is understood to be created by circumstance, like by context, then it also becomes clear that men, women, children all can be vulnerable because they are all in situations that render them vulnerable. So that is more or less the starting point for my talk. And so I've been trying to think also about how to then conceptualize possibly displaced men and masculinity, so that actually there is some sort of progressive potential, rather than that we get stuck on what is sometimes called the substance of masculinity. So a sort of like static, rigid understanding of a certain vulnerable man. So moving away from this idea of an individual crisis figure to understandings of male refugees through interdependency, through relationality. So these mechanisms that actually put people in vulnerable positions. And I think this is particularly important as scholars interested in everyday lives of refugees, because the ongoing representations of gender inequality in refugee communities tends to be used frequently as a sort of like ability or an inability of refugees to really govern themselves properly, and reinforces this narrative that people are always in need of help, in need of support, whereas this relationship obviously is way more complicated and should also emphasize agency at times. And just to briefly contextualize the study, this is the Netherlands, where I conducted my research. To be more precise, it was in the northern part of the Netherlands, which is a area of the Netherlands that is a rural area. It has one particular student city. The respondents came from different places in this region, which is mostly a white majority population, and it's considered one of the more secular areas of the Netherlands. So there are very few arrival infrastructures, for example, for migrants. The research topically focused on homemaking. So in my PhD, I was really interested in the participants' personal relationships to belonging, to home, the attachments that they developed during the first phases of arrival. And for this purpose, I used in-depth interviews and walk-along interviews. But then I also noticed during that process that I got stuck, and that's where also my thinking started around care and caring. Very specifically, also the reception of Syrian migrants in the Netherlands was very mixed. So on the one hand, there was significant social and political turbulence as these migrants were immediately brought into these conversations on job and housing scarcity that was going on in the Netherlands. In particular, also Syrians, if you would compare it, for example, to Eritrean or Ethiopian migrants that also came to the Netherlands at the time, Syrians actually received also quite some attention in a positive way. So there, a lot of welcoming activities were organized, activities that would, in neighborhoods or in cities, would bring people together, eating activities, for example. So this was also a very mixed response to their resettlement. And so, but in particular, migrants, Syrian migrant men, and this is a picture of a protest, which is, well, follows this stereotypical representation of asylum seekers who are here to rape our daughters. This is what it literally says. And so this perception of Syrian migrants on the one hand was gendered in the sense that Syrian migrant men were supposed to be kept out, whereas Syrian migrant women were in need of help, which also translated into a problematic context itself. And at the same time, the nature of the response also caused that this transpired in the everyday lives of Syrian men. So it was also gendering at the same time, producing different forms of masculinities and representations. So maybe also just to clarify my theoretical approach to understanding masculinities, and my research builds on the work of geographers, and in particular the field of geographies of masculinities. So for me, I think masculinities are very fluid, mobile, at times contradictory also, depending on context. And so on the one hand, I see masculinity as a gender identity that can be expressed, that can be experienced, that can be enacted, but also an ideology. And where my interest lies is where this interest intersects. So how different ideologies regarding, let's say, hegemonic masculinity, how they clash with forms of masculinity that people have developed throughout the life course. So as a social construction, relationality is very important. Masculinity is constructed in relation to various bodies, differences, different identities, discourses, ideologies. And as such, it is also something that can be used, something that can be enacted with a certain goal. So in that sense, I follow also definition but used by Gorman, Murray, and Hopkins, that masculinities can also be seen as a performance in any given context to achieve a certain goal related to well-being, related to finding a new place to live in this case. So these are, for me, then also ongoing processes that also stretch geographical boundaries across various spatial scales. And what I've been very interested in is also how these are negotiated transnationally. So how, in the case of Syrian migrants, for example, how they would negotiate these relationships through which forms of masculinities take shape, how they negotiate them, for example, with brothers, sisters in different countries, their parents still living in Syria, maybe in Turkey, Egypt, because they get mixed signals when it comes to masculinities from these different contexts. And so, just very briefly on hegemonic masculinity. Hegemonic masculinity, for me, has been a fruitful way to understand how masculinities are used, are performed. Masculinities have also been accused to provide a too rigid, too static idea of masculinity. So for me, it's not necessarily of a strict social order that consists of hegemonic, subordinated, complicit, marginalized forms of men and masculinities, but rather this for me is very fluid. So in any given context, social context, political context, cultural context, this most honored form of being a man changes and is also differently perceived by different people, depending on life course, depending on context. But what I find especially interesting is Young, who wrote an article on actually how hegemonic masculinity is often misunderstood, often with a focus on substance, so referring to the sort of like inherent masculine qualities that we consider hegemonic, rather than actually the relations through which these power dimensions actually operate. So the mechanisms of domination, of unequal gender relations. And as I said, for me, then also it becomes highly conflictual, contradictory, because hegemonic masculinity on the one hand may be careless or maybe carefree, but in other contexts, in other situations, in other temporalities, men are certainly not. They also have intimate and reciprocal care needs and desires. And so in this article, Hegemonic Masculinities After Forced Migration, my co-author Bettina van Hoven and I, we tried to conceptualize hegemonic masculinity as a relational performance, something that is on the one hand demasculinizing. At the time, there was a lot of emphasis on work. This also comes to the asylum and integration system that is predominantly masculine. And for the emphasis for many of participants in that time was also that they feel that they need to contribute, that they need to pay back something to an asylum system and an integration system that is giving them these chances, which was in a way rather strange, because it would often go against their needs. They were often traumatized, especially in the beginning, but still they were often pushed in these situations where they were asked to become a real man, to show that even though they experienced status loss, that would not bring them down. And this was both family abroad, because people went also away with expectations, but also for participants, this was something that they would really feel in society. And so negotiating these different forms of masculinities and different attitudes towards gender roles and gender relations between, for example, places where their parents would still remain, but also the life course events that they would experience, the downward mobility that they would experience, it was sometimes very troubling. And here we see also a bit like intersectionality in terms of class, where Hamza here mentioned that he was offered several positions when he was applying for a job, and that based on his appearance, based on stereotypes, it was assumed that he would be willing to drive a cab or to work a cleaning job. Whereas Hamza himself, he studied several years, so in his own mind, it felt as if he was put back several years in his life course, which for him was really made him feel out of place, made him feel he didn't belong. And as a response, he also said that this for him was a reason to actually perform a type of masculinity that was expected from him. And this sort of like masculine strategy was used by others as well to produce what would be more respectable forms of masculinities in their eyes. So actually using forced migration and spaces related to resettlement as a rite of passage and to work towards an economically self-sufficient male. And so also at the time, it was a period in which the construction sector in the region had a lot of job opportunities. So a lot of these men that I spoke with, they worked construction jobs. And although they did not see this as their future, it did give them some sort of feeling of trying to regain their manhood, being able to tell to family, to friends that they were providing for themselves instead of relying on social welfare benefits. So that was a mechanism that really shows how the context plays a role in what sort of masculinities are performed by migrant men. So, and moving on to intersectionality. So I agree, hegemonic masculinity often conceptualizes very rigid understandings of men. And so I really like to work on intersectionality, in particular Christensen and GenSeM and Huizinga and Huizinga, who also integrate in this intersectionality framework issues around place, social identity categories, class, race, or age, and as well personal biographies, because I think the personal dimension of masculinity is also often is a bit underexplored compared to social identity factors. And so what I think intersectionality can do or can mean for masculinity research is also to highlight the specific vulnerabilities and subjectivities that also arise due to different intersections. And I want to provide two examples of this. So the Syrian men I spoke with, they had there were two different age groups, more or less. So very young migrants who were unable to go to school in Syria because of the civil war. At the same time, there was this group, as Hamza I talked about earlier, who were able to conduct their studies, had work experience, had some sort of idea of life course advancement in terms of family life, buying a house, buying a car, elements that could indicate that they were doing well. So there was a very big difference age-wise between how these two groups experienced their new environment, and also in particular what they did to perform their masculinities. And so for many of the older men, what was quite tough was that they were confronted with the same narratives from family, that they had to advance in their life course, that they were already too old to be single, and this was additionally to the struggles that they had in their new environment in the Netherlands, where they had different priorities: finding work, dealing with trauma, dealing with their well-being, social isolation. So often they would also perform a different masculinity, let's say on the phone, talking to their parents, compared to how they would define manhood in the Netherlands. Additionally, what I thought was really important was also the way how these young Syrian migrant men who had various religious affiliations, and 20% of the participant group was Christian, for example, Kurdish, but still they would often be misrecognized, for example, when they were looking for jobs, as Muslim people. And in the Netherlands, there is a structural exclusion of Muslim people in the labor market for decades. In particular, Moroccan and Turkish guest laborers who arrived in the 60s was the starting point of this discourse. And so there is a racial hierarchy between first order and second order citizenship, which, according to, for example, Gorashi as an author, has been leading to contemporary process of Islamophobia. So this is also something that participants encountered in their everyday lives. So also here, again, it was not only about their migration status, their gendered position, but also how they were racialized and seen by people. And so, so these are, I think, conceptions of masculinities that lead to empirical findings that show these important vulnerabilities, that show these important inequalities that we really need to understand possibly displaced men and masculinities in more detail. But at the same time, I feel that then it gets stuck, and that it's, as I said before, that it focuses on that individual crisis figure. And so I've been thinking about other ways of trying to look more at these relations and how they operate. And so I'm particularly interested in informal caring practices as encountered between different individuals. And so I've been trying to put this more practice-based framework of Eliot, caring masculinity, so trying to research the data that I gathered throughout my PhD, but then through a lens of care, especially with the idea that masculine identities have been argued to have this ability to reject domination and embrace other values, values of care, such as positive emotion, interdependence, and relationality. And I want to close off with some examples. Do I have time, so what? I feel I'm a bit over time. Okay. So this is a place in Groningen, the student city that I mentioned briefly before. It was a place that was often visited, for example, during our walk-along interviews. It is a place actually meant for tourists, but throughout my research, I also found out that it was actually occupied quite often by these young men. And they would meet there, they would eat there together, they would play music. It was a place where they were trying to claim a bit, to claim their position in the society, if you will. So becoming visible, engaging also with people. And what was interesting is that these conversations that they had there, they were also often used to exchange information, exchange different types of resources, practice Dutch language, but also battling loneliness that they were all experiencing, and trying to find comfort, at least dealing with also issues back home. And so, as he's also mentioned here, and I think it was after half a year that he was in Groningen that he started to really feel that he belonged to that place. And for him, it was a place that he would associate with care, so with being with his friends, which I think is a very important part in resettlement research, because friendships often don't really service as much. So a place where they could share their common issues, but also very practical forms of support. So I said that many of these men, they were distributed in the northern Netherlands. So some were living in villages, sometimes up to 50 kilometers away. The Netherlands is not that big, but the city Groningen only has 2 halal butchers. So what I thought was very creative and also very interesting is that they made some sort of system in which they would take the bus, which was quite costly, to go to the butcher and then distribute the meat after among friends. So it was again an informal network in which care was really prominent. We want to eat a certain type of meat, and we want to make sure that our friends eat that too. So that I thought was also really interesting. What was more problematic, that these caring practices were also practiced in transnational family spaces, which I think often also remains visible in the literature on migrant men and masculinities. But I think it's a good example of how caring operates between geographical boundaries, and also demonstrates the sort of the different temporalities that refugee men negotiate in trying to define manhood. And so, especially for Wasim here, he had a really difficult time personally, but also the fact that he was not with his family, that he didn't have them around. And but at the same time, for him to not show this vulnerability, to not show his emotions to his mother in the case of this quote, was also a way of caring, a way of showing that he was doing fine where he was really not. So what I've called like a sort of like unemotional performance of masculine care, which I thought was a really good example of also a bit of the contradictions and that caring is not always only positive. And finally, just another quote that I think illustrates this constant conflict that participants experience when being confronted with their vulnerability, when being confronted with either they did not have an outlet for their emotions, or they decided not to show their emotions, was that also with neighbors, so more focused on relations of neighboring relations, let's say, that this sometimes also put them in the spots that was actually an undesired spot. So people caring for them, and they were not able to respond, at least in their eyes, properly to that to those caring practices. And so being overwhelmed with kindness on the one hand, but also made some of the participants, in this case MOAs, feel very out of place. So as if he was taken care of, and on the one hand he questions why he deserved it, and he also felt that on the other hand, this was kind of difficult for him because he was constantly confronted with men around him that were providers to their families. So these caring practices of neighbors actually emphasized that part, that he was unable to do that yet. And that's where I think I want to leave it. So I hope these narratives of some of the participants that I have spoken with, that they can function as some counter narratives, so that at least maybe do something to dismantle inequalities in gender relations. And I think it shows that refugee men, equally like refugee women and refugee children, are subject to particular conditions that create vulnerabilities and insecurities, both in host societies, transit spaces I did not discuss, but obviously those also play a role in life course events, but especially also the transnational spaces that are often overlooked. And so my hope here is that through thinking through hegemony, thinking through intersectionality, and then thinking through care, that we are able to provide new perspectives on everyday lives that hopefully can be used to change policy, popular discourses that shape these lives of migrant men, I think, disproportionately. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rick. It has been amazing. And your talk made me think about the concept of split masculinities, where these migrant men, they behave as hegemonic masculine over phone when they're talking back home, but at the very same time, they face these subordinate masculinities in their host countries, right? And it also, this things about refugee men that you talked about, like the victimization, I would say, of these vulnerable men leads to their delayed masculinities to some extent. That because a lot of, I mean, from my research, I study Bangladeshi migrant men in Canada. A lot of these men, they come here as students or at a young age, so that they can get the permanent residency, which would lead to citizenship. After some time, they will get married. They will bring their family over here to be that provider, to be that man at their home. Anyway, so I just have one question for you. So I was reading a study by Ibrahim Khaled. He wrote this on the Bangladeshi Muslim migrant men in Hague, Netherlands. So what there he mentioned, like when these men are struggling with this subordinate masculine status, so what they do, they emphasize their role as breadwinners and devoted family men to negotiate this marginalized masculinities, and they contrast themselves not just against that white men, but also other Muslim men, showing them how better family oriented men they are. So they are, yes, they are marginalized outside home in the broader society, but they are trying to at least hold on, because you see, when their family members are with them, they see the vulnerabilities of these men every day to day life. So to negotiate with that, they do take this caring approach of being a family centered man, which does not go the usual definition of hegemonic masculinities. So did you see anything with your participants like this? Thank you.
I'm not sure what the question is
yeah.
but you mean in terms of communities, expectations from communities or whatsoever?
Okay, so let me rephrase it. Sorry about the misconception. So my question is, do the Syrian migrant men that you studied, they also take a particular form of masculinity that shows that they are better men, not just in contrast of white men in the Netherlands, but also the other migrant communities or maybe migrant Muslim communities?
Right. Yeah, that's a good question. Thank you. So what I think it relates maybe also a bit to what I was thinking about when Marc, with the discussion of Marc's presentation. So I think what surfaced in my research was what you could call internal boundary making processes. And this is, I think, also where intersectionality again comes in. For example, men using job status, using classed forms of a class idealized type of manhood to confirm their status in relation to others. At the same time, I always find this a bit problematic because I feel that this performance of a, let's say, a better type of man is in relation to constant marginalization, discrimination, racialization. So in that sense, I always find that a bit of an uncomfortable part. What is interesting in the context of care is that also caring is often used as a actual hegemonic practice. So where certain caring practice, let's say fathering, and emphasizing being a good father, is also used as a practice to position, and we use as a practice to position yourself differently from other men who are not good fathers. So also care can actually have, in that sense, a detrimental effect on understanding caring masculinity. Does it answer the question somewhat, or I feel I was?
Yeah, it does, but I have so many questions. We will talk about it some other time. So I'll just open the floor for our participants if you want to have any question or any comments for it. Yes, Svetlana.
Hi, so now I can talk. My colleague already left. So you hear me well?
Yeah.
Yes, I more have a comment than a question, I think. So I wanted to thank you for this very insightful talk. I really enjoyed listening to you. I'm working on aging in in context of mass labor migration. And well, one of the aspects that I have been looking on and will be hopefully writing a paper about this at the end of next year is about how, well, elderly men transitioning to retire, so basically like the life course perspective that you have been talking about, so how they, experience it. It's very challenging to retire from very mobile lives. And also to live up to ideals of, good fathers, of having transmitted in an appropriate way to their children, and so on and so on. So it's, was really insightful, and I've been speaking to many things in your talk. And another small comment I have. So in my working group, it's called Aging in a Time of Mobility, based at the Max Planck Institute for the Study of Religious and Ethnic Diversity in Göttingen. And we had a visiting researcher here, so she's a PhD researcher based at McGill University. She just submitted her PhD thesis, and this looks on how refugee men navigate and successfully claim belonging through care, work in German nursing homes, and so I can write her name in the chat. I don't know, maybe it's also something where you can look upon, because might be speaking also to the care.
That would be great. Yeah, thank you very much.
Thanks a lot.
Yes, Benjamin, go ahead, please.
Yeah, also just brief thank you from my side as well. It's really, really insightful, and I've actually also read the paper that you that you have shown. So that was really, really interesting. I just want to sort of really highlight again in this round, sort of also when we apply an intersectional perspective, right? That we do not individualize the respective persons. Like it's not about like either your certain age or whatever, your certain religion or sex or whatever. But of course, it's the combination of all of it. And what you showed really clearly is like the respective position that people take within their family, right? And within let's say their broader care relations or care networks in which they are embedded. So I think in that like strand of research, it's really important, in my opinion, like to. So I think it was very, very, very contrasting in a way, sort of with Marc's presentation. It was very much on a macro level, like the right-wing populism and how it works, and the migrant man. Or so it was very, very macro. Yours was closer to the micro level of the respective I think mostly Syrian refugees, but I think really the meso level here is really the decisive one, sort of to understand sort of how individuals are embedded in family networks, in broader structures that reach or stretch across places, like in a transnational space, they unfold in a transnational space, and how they navigate gender, so to speak, and how they navigate their masculinity in all of these dimensions. So I think here, and I just found it intriguing. Sort of, I worked in a project called Traffic: Transnational Figurations of Displacement, where we applied a figurational lens borrowed from Norbert Elias, sort of, which really centers around these networks of displaced people. And in a paper, Simone Quist and I, in GenSeM, sort of, we identified different social figurations in which displaced people are embedded and that stretch across a transnational space. And one of them we called, let's say, the lone yet connected traveler, which would seem to be like also a case of that you mostly described, sort of the younger men who have been arriving alone, and their sort of loneliness, their care strategies, their practices to overcome also challenges, and how they're sort of negotiating their masculinity. But it's certainly really a very different position and different problems for somebody who has had family reunification, and again for another one who is already a father but is separated, forcibly separated from his family, and cannot realize family reunification, or what Svetlana just mentioned, like somebody who's entering retirement and now also is in a very different stage in his life journey. So I think these very different, let's say, social constellations, and I think in all of them, sort of the notion of like how you enact masculinity is a very, very different one. So being really sort of sensitive to the respective position within these social figurations is something very, very important. And the question then is sort of whether sort of these other sort of social constellations, or whether also whether in the public and social work around these issues, whether there's awareness about these different social figurations in which these people are embedded in, which I often think is not the case.
So you mean like different the organizations that are related to settlement of people, or well, this I I agree, Benjamin, and I think you're going back to your point on intersectionality. You're also absolutely right there, and for me, I mostly look at migration status and then gender, and then how those intersect with other identity categories, markers like age, race. Your question on, I think there's a lot of misinterpretation in terms of also how culturally masculine behavior of, in this case, Syrian people is understood or misunderstood, actually, quite often. So I think people tend to, if we're talking about volunteers, or if we're talking about language coaches or teachers, then often reason from their own experience of what they have been confronted with as ideal types of masculinity. And migration adds a completely different layer, I guess, to that configuration that indeed I think is often misunderstood, and maybe at times also where people don't want to understand. I don't know if that satisfies in any case the question, but in my experience, I during my field work, I was also working as a volunteer in a asylum seeker center where we would handle then the asylum applications, and I felt that there was also a generational difference in how we would approach people coming in to apply for asylum. And so, a generation of feminists from the 60s, from the 70s, with very different ideas of male vulnerability, whether that can actually exist, and whether attention for masculinities is actually something that we maybe should not do. This I found very striking, and was also often a ground for an argument between people who are desperate. So they feel that their achievements are being taken away by them, and then having to explain that to a person that really is not able to grasp that complexity or understand the emotions that also come with that.
Thank you so much, Rick. Just a personal anecdote, what I saw in my research, that interestingly, because for my PhD, I've interviewed men aged from, like, let's say as young as 21 to as old as 65, who are migrants in Canada from Bangladesh, and their length of stay also varied from a month to like 30 plus years. But what was interesting that to most of them, their length of stay, in contrast to the other studies, as we see that with the length of stay, maybe they are more open to the so-called Western culture or society, which is almost completely different from what was in Bangladesh when they came here. Didn't much change. So the age, or neither age nor the length of stay actually changed their mindset of how they see masculinities or how they define, because most of them didn't really understood the term masculinities because it was really hard and a foreign term to them. But how a man should be didn't change much. Like the people who were really open and progressive, it didn't really depend on their length of stay in Canada or their age. They were just like, I've seen men like 56 and they were open, and then men as 21 who were not. But there, Benjamin's point made me think about maybe it's not just one or two angles, but the constellation. Like if somebody has been to a foreign culture for, let's say, 30 years, they could be more open if they were not before. And again, people who were more open or accepting to change, they came here 2 years ago and they are still open. So it is complicated. Thank you, Benjamin, for mentioning that.
So, may I add something? I think there was a question in the program that you circulated, and I think it was framed in the sense of how do migrant men negotiate hegemonic masculinity after migration, or in the whole society context, which I think I think I want to emphasize here that what I think is also often forgotten is how that was negotiated prior to migration, or even during migration. And because there seems to be then a sort of like, seems to have the idea that, let's say in Syria, masculine identities are homogeneous or monolithic. Whereas, of course, in every given context, there are different experiences, different life course events that shape idealized forms of masculinities in different ways. So I think the question, how is it shaped in a host society, actually is also a question, how was it shaped prior to migration? How is this process, or this experience continuing to define masculinities in post-migration?
That's right. So thank you, Rick. We passed our scheduled time. So thank you all who were here, and also my sincere thanks to people who were here but had to leave for some reasons. It was really amazing and engaging discussions. Thanks to Marc, who is not here, and Rick for coming here and sharing your insight, your input with us, and thanks to others as well who raised their questions and really interesting comments. Thank you everyone for being here.